How did a small island in the North Sea rise to dominate the world and build an empire so vast they said the sun never set upon it? This is the story of the British Empire, and welcome to Twilight Tales. Chapter 1. The Origins. Part 1. The First Maritime Explorations. The sea. It was from her that England's destiny was born. For centuries, this kingdom was but one island among others. Battered by the winds and storms of the Atlantic, living turned toward its fields, its forests, and its rivers. But from the 16th century onward, a slow and irresistible transformation began. The English raised their eyes to the maritime horizon and understood that a vast future opened before them, beyond the waves. The world was then undergoing profound change. The Portuguese and the Spanish already dominated the seas, sending their caravels to Africa, Asia, and the Americas. Spain, crowned with the exploits of Christopher Columbus, had built a flamboyant empire, nourished by the gold and silver of the New World. Portugal, for its part, controlled the maritime routes to India and China. England, meanwhile, seemed destined to remain a spectator, confined to its gray and rainy island. But rivalry, curiosity, and a thirst for adventure would soon break these chains. Under the reign of the Tudors, England entered a new era. Henry VIII, and especially his daughter Elizabeth I, encouraged bold sailors to take to the sea. These men, half explorers, half pirates, would trace the first lines of an imperial adventure. They were called John Cabot, Francis Drake, Walter Raleigh, Martin Frobisher. Their names still resonate as those of pioneers whose sails, swollen by the wind, seemed to carry the dreams of an entire people. John Cabot was one of the very first. Venetian by birth, but supported by the English crown, he set sail in 1497 toward the northwest seas of the Atlantic. It is said that he reached the coasts of what is now Canada. He planted the cross of St. George on a frozen and misty land, symbolically opening the door to a future empire in North America. Yet his expedition did not have the immediate consequences one might have imagined. England still lacked the means and a clear vision. But the seed was sown. It was not until the following century that English boldness fully asserted itself. In the 1560s and 1570s, the seas became the theater of a merciless struggle. The enemy was none other than Spain, the richest and most feared power in Europe. Its galleons brought back fabulous cargoes from the mines of the Americas, tons of silver, gold, and precious stones. For the English, these treasures represented an irresistible temptation. It was then that the sea dogs appeared. Francis Drake was the most famous among them, a daring sailor, an unscrupulous corsair. He roamed the seas in the service of Queen Elizabeth. He captured Spanish ships, attacked ports in the New World, and became a living legend. In 1577, he even undertook a circumnavigation of the globe, an exploit only Magellan had achieved before him. When Drake returned to England in 1580, laden with riches and fabulous stories, the Queen herself came to greet him. It is said that she knighted him aboard his ship, a dazzling sign of the glory now attached to these corsair sailors. But behind the glory lay a darker side. For these English expeditions were also tied to the birth of a tragic trade, that of slaves. As early as the 1560s, another sailor, John Hawkins, took part in the Atlantic slave trade. He captured Africans and sold them by force in the Spanish colonies. This inhumane commerce, in which England would later become a major player, was already part of the beginnings of maritime expansion. The empire was built on audacity, but also on violence and exploitation. At the same time, another figure captured the imagination, Walter Raleigh. More noble, more learned than Drake, Raleigh dreamed of founding lasting colonies. In 1585, he launched the expedition that created the Roanoke colony on the east coast of North America. But this attempt failed. Famine, disease, and conflicts with local populations led to the abandonment of the settlement. The mysterious disappearance of the Roanoke colonists, left without explanation, remains to this day a fascinating enigma of colonial history. These failures, however, did not halt England's momentum. The sea had become an obsession, a horizon toward which all eyes turned. In the ports of Plymouth and London, ships were built, maps were drawn, crews were armed, sailors dreamed of fortune and glory, merchants saw opportunities for limitless trade, and the crown itself began to envision a grander destiny. The decisive moment came in 1588. That year, the Spanish Armada, an immense fleet sent by King Philip II, attempted to invade England. The English, outnumbered, put up fierce resistance. Francis Drake, John Hawkins, and their companions led their faster and more maneuverable ships against the heavy Spanish galleons. The wind, the storm, and the skill of the English sailors did the rest. The Armada was defeated. This triumph resonated as a revelation. Henceforth, England knew it could challenge Spain on its own ground. The victory over the Armada marked a turning point. It gave the English not only a sense of security, but also the conviction that their future lay on the sea. Explorers and corsairs gave way to more ambitious projects, establishing colonies, controlling routes, building a maritime economy. The decades that followed saw the first foundations of what would become the largest empire in history. Yet, at the end of the 16th century, nothing was yet certain. England remained fragile, its colonies precarious, its resources limited. But the will had been born. In the roar of Drake's cannons, in Raleigh's dreams, in the cross planted by Cabot on a frozen land, a destiny was announced that would transform the world. For from these first explorations, a certainty gradually emerged. England was no longer just an island. It was becoming a maritime power, marching toward the unknown, carried by the winds and the ambitions of its sailors. And already, in the mists of the future, the immense shadow of the British Empire was taking shape, one on which one day the sun would never set. Part 2. The East India Company and Expansion in Asia. England had tasted the seas, and the echo of Drake's victories and the Armada's defeat had inflamed minds. But if the Atlantic and the Americas seemed promising, another horizon, more distant, more mysterious still, irresistibly attracted English ambitions: the East. For it was there in Asia that the most coveted riches of the time were found: spices, silk, cotton, precious stones, treasures that fired the imagination and fueled the power of European kingdoms. Portugal and Spain thanks to the exploits of Vasco da Gama and Magellan, had already gained a head start. Lisbon had established itself as a hub of Asian trade, and Seville grew rich with treasures from the Americas. But in the taverns of London, in the salons of merchants, an idea was growing. Why leave these riches in the hands of rivals when England, too, could claim its share of the spoils? In 1600, under the reign of Elizabeth I, this ambition took concrete form, the creation of the English East India Company. This was no ordinary project, but a revolutionary enterprise. The Crown granted the company a charter, giving it a monopoly on English trade with Asia. Behind this document lay a vision to combine the private power of merchants with the strength of the state to create a tool capable of rivaling the Iberian empires. The company was more than a group of traders. It was a formidable machine with its own ships, crews, trading posts, and soon its armies. Its first objectives were the Indies, that vast subcontinent that had fascinated Europe for centuries. The English arrived cautiously at first, establishing trading posts in Surat, then in Madras, Bombay, and Calcutta. But behind these tentative steps, an influence was already taking shape that would only grow. The voyages were perilous. The company's ships faced terrible storms, deadly diseases, and ruthless rivals. The Dutch, too, had founded their own East India Company, the VOC, fearsomely organized and already powerful in Indonesia. Between the English and the Dutch, conflicts were bloody, naval battles, sabotage, massacres in trading posts. But despite these trials, England persisted, convinced that the East was the key to its future. In the Indian markets, English merchants discovered riches they had never imagined. Spices, first, so precious that they were worth their weight in gold in Europe, but also textiles, fine cottons, dazzling silks, which would seduce London's fashionable society. Each cargo brought back to England enriched not only the merchants, but also the Crown, which took its share of the profits. Gradually, the company became a pillar of the national economy, a source of prosperity and power. Yet, this trade was not a simple transaction. It came with political intrigues, military pressures, and conquests. The English did not content themselves with buying and selling. They fortified their trading posts, recruited soldiers, imposed their influence on Indian princes. The East India Company, under the guise of a merchant enterprise, was already behaving like a sovereign power. In London, its shareholders grew rich. Its directors took an increasingly prominent role in state decisions. The City of London, the beating heart of English finance, became intimately linked to the colonial adventure. This marriage of money, trade, and conquest would become a defining characteristic of the British Empire. Beyond India, the English also began to set foot elsewhere, in Asia. In Bantam, in present-day Indonesia, they tried to compete with the Dutch in the pepper trade. In Japan, they briefly established a trading post in Hirado, though this venture ended quickly. In Persia, they sought to trade with the Safavid rulers. Everywhere, the company extended its tentacles, weaving a network of relations, alliances, and rivalries. What few understood at the time was that the company was unwittingly laying the foundations of a global empire. Its ships connected England to distant shores. Its cargoes transformed consumption habits. Its local wars foreshadowed future conquest, and already India, that vast and diverse land, was becoming a vital stake for England. But Asian expansion was not limited to India. The English also looked to China. Fascinated by its silk and porcelain, they dreamed of trade with Canton, though this market remained largely closed to Europeans. Further still, in their imaginations, the idea of a limitless world took shape, where every port, every bay, every river could become a link in a British network. To finance this adventure, more than audacity was needed. Organization was required, and the East India Company knew how to invent unprecedented methods. It issued shares, distributed profits, built a sprawling administration. It became a state within a state, with its own language, its own rules, its own flag. When its ships returned to the Thames, laden with spices and textiles, it was all of London that lit up with their riches. Of course, this expansion came at a cost. Crews died by the hundreds from scurvy, dysentery, or malaria. Rivalries between Europeans sparked bloodbaths. And above all, for the Asian peoples, the company's presence heralded an era of domination and exploitation. The English arrived first as guests, but soon they behaved as masters. Local wars, betrayed alliances, and territorial seizures were but the prelude to a vaster conquest. Thus, at the turn of the 17th century, England was no longer merely an island power. Thanks to the East India Company, it had planted its roots in Asia. These were still fragile trading posts, surrounded by powerful enemies. But already, an inexorable logic was set in motion. England had understood that its imperial future was not confined to the Atlantic. It extended to the east, where wealth and power were being written. And in this strange marriage of merchants' ambition and the force of arms, between the appetite for trade and the thirst for domination, a new monster was born. A private company becoming an empire in the making. For in the swollen sails of ships leaving London for Surat or Bombay, in the bales of spices and silk unloaded in the city, the future of an unrivaled empire was already taking shape. An empire that would make England not only a nation of sailors, but also the mistress of much of the known world. Part 3. The wars against Spain, Holland, and France for control of the seas. The sea, in the 17th century, had become the theater of a fierce struggle. The oceans were no longer merely routes for trade or exploration. They were now battlefields where global supremacy was at stake. For England, a young and still fragile naval power, the test of fire would come not only from Spain but also from the United Provinces and France. Three formidable rivals, three maritime empires, three enemies to confront, to conquer the oceans. Spain was the first adversary. Already weakened by the defeat of its armada in 1588, it remained a colossal power, nourished by the gold and silver of the New World. Its galleons continued to carry fabulous cargoes from the Americas to Seville. For the English, these ships were prime targets. Corsairs and sailors launched by the Crown hunted these floating treasures, intercepted convoys, and multiplied daring raids. Each attack on Spain enriched England and bolstered its prestige. Yet, over time, the most formidable enemy was not Spain, but an unexpected neighbor, the United Provinces, the young Dutch Republic. Having emerged victorious from its struggle against Spanish rule, Holland had established itself as a nation of unparalleled merchants and sailors. Its ships plied every sea, from Indonesia to Brazil, and its East India Company, the VOC, dominated Asian trade with fearsome efficiency. England, seeing in it a direct rival, soon entered a series of open conflicts. These were the Anglo-Dutch Wars, which marked the entire 17th century. The first broke out in 1652 under Oliver Cromwell's government. The English Republic had just adopted the Navigation Act, a law reserving maritime trade to English ships, or those of the countries producing the transported goods. This measure, clearly aimed at the Dutch, was felt as a provocation. War was inevitable. The battles raged in the Channel, the North Sea, and even in the colonies. Naval engagements pitted entire fleets, with dozens of warships aligned. The names of admirals still resonate: Robert Blake on the English side, Martin Tromp, and Michiel de Ruyter on the Dutch side. Cannons roared, masts collapsed, decks were covered in blood. The outcome of these wars was uncertain, so closely matched were the two nations in power and determination. The First War, concluded in 1654, produced no clear victor, but affirmed England's resolve to control its maritime routes. The second, from 1665 to 1667, was even more violent. London itself suffered the humiliation when the Dutch sailed up the Thames and burned part of the English fleet at Chatham. But England learned from its defeats. Under the reigns of Charles II and James II, and then with the arrival of William of Orange, it strengthened its navy, refined its tactics, and built ever more powerful ships. The Third Anglo-Dutch War in 1672 saw England briefly ally with Louis of Tournef's France against Holland. But diplomatic calculations shifted quickly, and soon England and Holland realized they had more to gain by uniting against France than by tearing each other apart. By the end of the century, the two nations became allies in the fight against French hegemony. But this naval rivalry, spanning several decades, had forged England's maritime identity. France, indeed, became the third great adversary in the 17th century. Under the reign of the Sun King, Louis XVIII sought to make his kingdom a maritime power to match its terrestrial might. His minister, Colbert, developed an impressive navy, built modern arsenals, and launched fleets capable of challenging the English. Louis XIV's wars, the War of the Dutch, the War of the League of Augsburg, the War of the Spanish Succession, provided numerous occasions for English and French ships to clash in titanic battles. The Battle of La Hougue in 1692 was one of the most decisive. The French, allied with supporters of James II, sought to restore the deposed king to the English throne. But the Anglo-Dutch fleet, commanded by Admiral Russell, inflicted a heavy defeat on the French navy. Dozens of ships were burned, and English supremacy in the Channel was secured for a long time. These constant clashes shaped a new world order. England understood that its survival and greatness depended on the sea. It invested in its Royal Navy, developed powerful arsenals at Portsmouth and Chatham, and perfected its ships of the line. The battles of the 17th century were not merely wars of prestige. They were schools where the art of dominating the oceans was learned. And while cannons roared in the North Sea or the Atlantic, colonies also became battlefields. The Caribbean, with its sugar plantations, was a major stake. The English, French, and Dutch fought over every island, every port, every sheltered bay. In North America, colonial rivalries were already taking shape, foreshadowing the conflicts of the next century. Everywhere, trade, war, and politics mingled in a global struggle. By the end of the 17th century, England had not yet crushed its rivals. Spain remained present in the Americas, Holland still dominated Asia, and France remained a feared power. But something had changed. England had forged an identity, that of a nation of sailors, always ready to fight to defend its roots, its trade, its ambitions. The Royal Navy, a secondary tool at the century's start, had become the very soul of the kingdom. In its ships of the line, its disciplined crews, its courageous admirals, lay the key to the imperial future. For the British Empire, before being terrestrial, was first a maritime empire, born from the clash of cannons and the breath of storms. Thus ended the first century of English expansion. From a hesitant island, England had become a respected and feared naval power. It had stood up to Spain, fought Holland, and challenged France. It had not yet conquered the world, but it had proven it had the will and the means to do so. And already, at the dawn of the 18th century, a new chapter loomed, that of revolutions, lost colonies, and the consolidation of an empire that, little by little, would embrace the entire planet. Chapter 2: The Age of Revolutions and Lost Colonies. Part 1: British Naval Supremacy, after the Wars of Succession and the 7 Years' War. At the turn of the 18th century, England was no longer merely a warrior island that had resisted the Spanish Armada or confronted Holland on the seas. It was now a rising power, a nation beginning to understand that its destiny was played out on the oceans. The century ahead would be one of great European wars, and in each, the sea would become a crucial battlefield. It was there, in the roar of cannons and the wake of fleets, that British supremacy would gradually assert itself. From the century's start, Europe plunged into a large-scale conflict, the War of the Spanish Succession, 1701-1714. The issue was simple. Who would inherit the vast Spanish Empire after the death of the last Habsburg of Spain, Charles II, who died without an heir? Two contenders emerged: Philip of Anjou, grandson of Louis XIV, supported by France, and Archduke Charles of Austria, backed by a coalition including England and the United Provinces. This war was long and complex, mixing land campaigns and naval battles. But for England, the main stake was clear: to prevent a united France and Spain from dominating Europe and the seas. The Royal Navy, now better organized and more powerful, played a decisive role. At Gibraltar in 1704, an Anglo-Dutch fleet seized the famous Rock, a strategic key to the Mediterranean. Gibraltar became a British possession from then on, a bastion never relinquished and already testifying to England's will to control the world's critical points. The naval battles of this war, notably those of Vigo and Malaga, confirmed the rising power of the English Navy. British admirals learned to maneuver their ships of the line with discipline, to concentrate their fire, to dominate through tactics as much as numbers. Each victory, each captured port, each intercepted convoy strengthened the conviction that England could become the world's foremost naval power. The Treaty of Utrecht, signed in 1730, marked a decisive step. Not only did it end the war, but it granted England immense advantages, Gibraltar and Minorca, but also the asiento, the monopoly on the slave trade to Spanish colonies in the Americas. This tragic commerce would greatly enrich English merchants and further strengthen the kingdom's maritime economy. Thus, through the interplay of arms and diplomacy, England established itself at the center of global trade. But it was in the mid-century, during the 7 Years' War, 1756-1763, that British naval supremacy shone most brightly. This conflict, sometimes called the First World War, engulfed not only Europe, but also the Americas, Africa, India, and distant seas. Everywhere, the English and their allies faced France and Spain in a planetary struggle. In North America, it was the War of the Conquest, pitting English and French colonists against each other for control of Canada. But behind the land campaigns, the key lay at sea. It was the British fleet that enabled the transport of reinforcements, blockaded French ports, and isolated colonies from their metropoles. At Quebec, in 1759, General Wolfe's victory over Montcalm marked the tipping point of the American continent into the English sphere. In India, the East India Company directly confronted French troops supported by local allies. The Battle of Plassey in 1757 enabled Robert Clive and the English to establish their domination over Bengal. But here, too, the Navy played an essential role, ensuring logistical superiority and cutting off French reinforcements. At sea, the Royal Navy amassed triumphs. The Battle of Lagos in 1759 and Hawke's victory at Quiberon Bay the same year were decisive moments. At Quiberon, the French fleet, attempting to invade England, was crushed. This victory ended the threat of a French invasion and confirmed English mastery of the Atlantic. It was called the Year of Victories, so total did English superiority seem. The Treaty of Paris, signed in 1763, consecrated this domination. France lost Canada, ceded most of its possessions in India, and abandoned numerous islands. Spain had to relinquish Florida. England emerged from the war as the great victor, mistress of the seas and holder of a vast colonial empire, stretching from North America to India, from the Caribbean to the African coasts. This naval supremacy was not merely a military matter. It became the foundation of British power. The Royal Navy protected merchant convoys, secured trade routes, and guaranteed the profits of companies. London, nourished by these colonial riches, became Europe's financial center. The city established itself as a beating heart where money circulated, where maritime insurance like that of Lloyd's took off. For English sailors, it was an era of glory and sacrifice. Life aboard ships remained harsh. Iron discipline, spoiled food, diseases like scurvy. But each victory, each captured enemy ship, each conquered port reminded these men that they were part of an immense adventure, that of making their nation the world's foremost maritime power. By the end of the 7 Years' War, one idea was evident everywhere. The sea belonged to the English. The Royal Navy, more numerous, better trained, and more disciplined than all its rivals, reigned over the oceans. This supremacy would become the very foundation of the British Empire, for without it, no trade, no colony, no conquest could have survived. But in the shadow of these triumphs, a danger was already looming. For North America, conquered from France, would soon ignite. The English colonists, proud of their freedom, jealous of their rights, would begin to challenge the Crown's authority. And so, barely had the British Empire reached its colonial zenith when it would be shaken by a revolution from its own subjects. Part 2. The Loss of the 13 American Colonies. The British Empire, in the wake of the 7 Years' War, seemed invincible. Its ships dominated the seas, its colonies stretched from India to America, and London saw itself at the center of an expanding world. But sometimes power carries the seeds of its own fragility. England would learn this painful lesson with its North American colonies, 13 prosperous provinces populated by proud colonists jealous of their freedoms, who would soon revolt against the metropole and inflict an irreparable loss. These colonies had been founded in the 17th century through sweat, courage, and violence. Virginia, Massachusetts, Pennsylvania, Georgia. Each had its history, its customs, its local institutions. Over time, they had become prosperous, exporting tobacco, cotton, timber, furs, and receiving manufactured goods from England in return. But these colonists, though attached to the British Crown, had developed their own identity, nourished by independence and liberty. They elected their assemblies, managed their affairs, and already spoke of natural rights. The 7 Years' War had shifted the balance. By driving France out of Canada, England had secured its American colonies. But this triumph came at a cost. The war had drained the British state's coffers. The London government, crushed by debt, decided that the colonists should contribute more. After all, hadn't they benefited the most from the victory? Thus began the tensions. New taxes were imposed. The Stamp Act in 1765, taxing documents and publications, the Townshend Acts in 1767, targeting imports. In London, it seemed logical that the colonies should contribute to the imperial effort. But in America, these taxes were felt as an intolerable attack on their rights. No taxation without representation became their rallying cry. For the colonists had no representatives in the Westminster Parliament. Why, then, should they pay for a power in which they had no voice? Tensions mounted year by year. In 1770, in Boston, a confrontation between British soldiers and residents escalated. 5 civilians were killed. This tragedy, known as the Boston Massacre, inflamed public opinion. 3 years later, in 1773, came the famous Boston Tea Party. To protest the tax on tea, colonists disguised as Indians threw entire cargoes belonging to the East India Company into the sea. This audacious gesture was an open challenge to London's authority. The British response was firm, almost brutal. Coercive laws were passed, dubbed the Intolerable Acts, by the colonists. Boston was placed under blockade, local assemblies restricted. But far from intimidating the colonists, these measures radicalized them. In 1774, they met in Philadelphia to form the First Continental Congress. The time was no longer for mere protest. It was for organizing resistance. The spark ignited in April 1775 at Lexington and Concord. British troops sent to disarm colonial militias met fierce resistance. Shots were fired. The war had begun. The colonists, now insurgents, took up arms against the metropole. They were not yet united, not yet organized, but the break was complete. In July 1776, the decisive step was taken. The Continental Congress adopted the Declaration of Independence, largely drafted by Thomas Jefferson. This document proclaimed that all men are created equal, that they possess inalienable rights, and that if a government violates them, the people have the right to overthrow it. These words, carried by the voices of figures like George Washington, Benjamin Franklin, and John Adams, marked the birth of a new nation, the United States of America. The War of Independence was long and bitter. The British, masters of the sea, occupied New York, Philadelphia, and other major cities. Their disciplined and powerful army faced poorly equipped colonial militias. But these insurgents, sustained by the fervor of their cause, knew their terrain and enjoyed growing support. Gradually, battles turned in their favor. At Saratoga in 1777, a decisive American victory convinced France to enter the war on their side. The French intervention changed everything. Louis XII, seeking to weaken his old British enemy, sent troops, money, and above all, a fleet. Now, England no longer faced mere rebellious colonists, but an international coalition. In 1781, at Yorktown, Washington's forces, supported by the Marquis de Lafayette and the French army under Rochambeau, surrounded the British army of General Cornwallis. The French fleet, under Admiral de Grasse, blocked any retreat by sea. Cornered, Cornwallis had to surrender. The war was lost. In 1783, the Treaty of Paris officially recognized the independence of the United States. England had lost a vast territory, a prosperous colony, a jewel of its empire. The shock was profound. For the first time, the British Empire retreated. The vision of unchallenged domination over the Americas collapsed. Yet in this disaster, England paradoxically found new strength. The loss of the 13 colonies pushed the crown and merchants to look elsewhere, toward India, Africa, Australia. This painful setback did not mark the end of the empire, but its transformation. Henceforth, Britain's future would be less in the North Atlantic than in the vast Indian Ocean and the still unexplored lands of the Pacific. Thus, the loss of the 13 colonies was both a wound and a turning point. It reminded England that imperial power was never assured, that it could break against the will of peoples determined to be free. But it also opened a new era, where the British Empire would rebuild itself, vaster still, on other continents. For if America slipped from its grasp, India became the jewel of the crown. And already on the horizon, new conquests and new horizons were emerging that would soon lead the British Empire to its zenith. Part 3, Expansion in India and the Foundations of the Empire in Australia. The loss of the 13 American colonies had shaken British pride, but the empire, far from collapsing, redeployed elsewhere. In the eyes of London strategists, one territory now emerged as the heart of imperial ambitions: India. This vast, rich subcontinent, populated by tens of millions, would become the jewel of the British crown. It had all begun a century earlier with the East India Company. But in the 18th century, this private company had transformed into a near-sovereign power. It had its own army, forts, and alliances with local princes. Its directors in London made decisions that affected thousands of lives on the other side of the world. The 7 Years' War had already given England a decisive advantage in India. In 1757, at Plassey, Robert Clive, with a handful of British soldiers and allied Indian troops, defeated the Nawab of Bengal and his French supporters. This triumph opened the richest region of India to British trade. The company's coffers filled with silver, silks, cottons, and spices. In the decades that followed, English influence expanded further. Local rivalries between kingdoms and principalities were skillfully exploited. The British signed treaties, lent money, supplied arms, and then, at the slightest opportunity, imposed their control. The company, outwardly a mere commercial intermediary, acted in reality as an empire within an empire. But this power had its excesses. The company's administrators, greedy for profit, burdened Indian peasants with crushing taxes. Corruption became widespread. Famines, like the one in Bengal in 1770 that killed millions, were exacerbated by the rapacity of colonial authorities. In England, a debate arose. Could a private enterprise be allowed to rule entire territories in this way? Gradually, the government intervened more, placing the company under stricter oversight. India became for London both an immense source of wealth and a political responsibility. British soldiers, called sepoys when recruited locally, formed a formidable army. Indian cities, from Calcutta to Madras, saw European quarters, fortifications, and prosperous trading posts rise. England, amputated of its American colonies, consoled itself by building an Eastern empire. But while India became an imperial pillar, another far more distant land entered Britain's orbit: Australia. This discovery was almost a coincidence, a direct consequence of the loss of the 13 colonies. For until then, England had sent many of its convicts to America to serve their sentences. Now, a new distant land was needed for penal colonies. In 1750, explorer James Cook had claimed the eastern coast of Australia for the Crown, naming it New South Wales. 18 years later, in 1788, the first fleet of settlers and convicts landed at Botany Bay, then at Port Jackson, where Sydney would later rise. The beginnings were harsh: famine, disease, isolation. The settlers struggled to survive in an environment they did not understand, while the Aboriginal peoples, present for millennia, already suffered the destructive effects of this colonization. Yet, little by little, the Australian colony took root. Regular convoys brought more prisoners, soldiers, and free settlers. The harsh but fertile Australian land was transformed into sheep pastures. Australian wool, exported to England, soon became an essential product for the nascent textile industry. Thus, by the end of the 18th century, the British Empire was recomposing itself. It lost one continent, but gained others. America had slipped away, but India and Australia became new horizons. Maritime routes lengthened. British ships roamed the globe, linking London to Calcutta, Sydney, the Cape, and the Caribbean. This redeployment also changed the nature of the empire. Once centered on trade, it was becoming increasingly territorial. Trading posts turned into provinces, alliances into annexations, and settler colonies expanded. England was no longer merely a merchant nation. It was becoming a full-fledged colonial power, directly administering millions of foreign subjects. But this expansion came at a price. In India, the company's excesses already sparked revolts. In Australia, the dispossession of Aboriginal peoples caused violence and tragedies. Everywhere, the empire grew through force as much as through trade. And already, in the shadow of these conquests, a question loomed that would haunt the centuries to come. How far could England extend its empire without breaking under its own weight? Yet, on the eve of the 19th century, the time was not yet for doubts. London vibrated with the pride of an empire expanding each year. India's riches filled the coffers. Australian wool began to circulate, and the Royal Navy, guardian of the seas, ensured the link between these distant worlds. The British Empire, humiliated in America, was reborn elsewhere, vaster, more diverse, more ambitious than ever. And soon, with the Industrial Revolution and the Victorian era, it would reach its zenith, becoming the greatest empire history had ever known. Chapter 3. The Victorian Zenith. Part 1. India, Jewel of the Crown. In the 19th century, the British Empire entered its golden age. England, now the United Kingdom since its union with Scotland, dominated the seas, guided by the Royal Navy. London, transformed by the Industrial Revolution, became the beating heart of global finance and trade. But beyond the ships and factories, one territory in particular symbolized imperial power and glory: India. It was said then that India was the jewel of the crown. No phrase better captured the importance of this subcontinent to Great Britain. Its riches, its human resources, its strategic position made it the central pivot of the empire. It was in India that England asserted its authority, in India that it demonstrated its ability to govern millions of foreign subjects. At the century's start, India was still dominated by the East India Company. This company, born for trade, had transformed into a political and military power. It directly controlled vast territories, commanded an army of several 100,000 men, most of whom were Indian soldiers, the famous sepoys. Through a mosaic of alliances, treaties, and conquests, the company imposed its law. But this system was not without tensions. Excessive taxation, corruption, and interference in local affairs sparked discontent. In 1857, an explosion occurred, the Sepoy Mutiny. Beginning as a military revolt triggered by the use of cartridges greased with pork and beef fat, an intolerable affront to Hindu and Muslim beliefs, it turned into a general insurrection. Garrisons rose up, cities ignited, and princes joined the revolt. For months, India experienced a bloody war marked by atrocities on both sides. The British repression was merciless. After fierce fighting, the revolt was crushed, but its consequences were immense. The Crown decided it could no longer allow the East India Company to govern alone. In 1858, the company was dissolved, and India came under direct royal administration. Queen Victoria was proclaimed Empress of India in 1876, sealing the symbolic link between the British monarchy and this vast territory. India then became the empire's center of gravity. The British developed a complex administration, blending officials from England with local elites integrated into power. Roads, canals, and above all railways were built to connect the provinces. India became a laboratory for imperial engineering, censuses, legal codes, tax systems. But this development had a dual face. On one hand, the infrastructure modernized the country, facilitated trade, and improved circulation. On the other, it primarily served the empire's interests, moving troops faster, exporting raw materials, importing British manufactured goods. Indian textiles, once prosperous, were crushed by competition from English factories. Millions of artisans lost their livelihoods, now dependent on the colonial economy. India provided the empire with far more than material wealth. Its soldiers were enlisted in all British wars, in Afghanistan, China, Africa. Its elites were integrated into colonial universities and administrations, forming an educated class that would one day spearhead nationalist movements. But in the 19th century, India remained above all the cornerstone of British domination. The symbolic importance was immense. For the Victorians, possessing India was to demonstrate to the world that Great Britain was not merely a commercial power, but an imperial one, capable of governing entire peoples. Every visit by a British dignitary, every official ceremony, every military parade in Delhi or Calcutta underscored the grandeur of the crown. Yet behind this facade, tensions persisted. The 19th century famines, exacerbated by indifferent colonial policies, killed millions. The gulf between rulers and ruled remained vast, and in the minds of some educated Indians, a new seed was sprouting, the idea that their country one day would take its destiny into its own hands. But that time had not yet come. In the heart of the 19th century, India was indeed the jewel of the empire. It enriched the metropole, fueled its industries, bolstered its prestige. The English saw in it the symbol of their self-proclaimed civilizing mission, justifying their domination with discourses of progress, order, and modernity. And for Queen Victoria, reigning in London, the title of Empress of India represented the pinnacle of her reign. Proof that the British Empire had achieved a truly global dimension. Thus, in the bustling streets of Calcutta, in the Bengal countryside, in the garrisons of Bombay, the shadow of the Union Jack loomed over millions of souls. India, both opulent and wounded, subdued and fascinated, had become the mirror of British ambition, vast, diverse, contradictory, but essential. And as long as the empire held this jewel, it could still claim global hegemony. Part 2. Africa and the Scramble for Africa. Africa, long on the margins of the British Empire's direct ambitions, became in the 19th century one of its most spectacular theaters of expansion. For centuries, the continent had been primarily linked to the slave trade, a tragedy in which the British, like other European powers, had played a considerable role. But in the 19th century, after the abolition of the slave trade and slavery in the empire, a new interest emerged: exploration, trade, conquest, domination. This was the era of the scramble for Africa, and the British Empire carved out an immense share. At the century's start, British presence in Africa was concentrated on a few strategic points. The Cape, in southern Africa, had been taken from the Dutch during the Napoleonic Wars. This colony, dominated by Dutch-origin settlers called Boers, was a vital stopover on the maritime route to India. Further north, Sierra Leone had been founded as a colony for freed slaves, and on the west coast, the British maintained trading posts to oversee commerce and combat illegal slave trafficking. But soon, the Victorian momentum, blending economic ambitions, imperial rivalries, and missionary ideology, pushed the English to penetrate deeper into the continent. Explorers paved the way. Names like David Livingstone and Henry Morton Stanley became famous across Europe. Livingstone, a missionary and explorer, traversed southern and central Africa, crossing regions unknown to Europeans, describing landscapes, peoples, and potential riches. His cry, "I am prepared to go anywhere, provided it be forward," summed up the spirit of conquest. Stanley, for his part, became famous for his encounter with Livingstone in the heart of Africa. Dr. Livingstone, I presume? A phrase that entered legend. But behind these romantic tales, imperial expansion was taking shape. Africa represented for the British a dual opportunity, securing strategic routes and exploiting immense resources. The discovery of gold and diamonds in South Africa in the 1860s and 1880s transformed the region into a major stake. Mining towns sprang up, colossal fortunes were made, and international appetites sharpened. In the east of the continent, Egypt and Sudan became essential. The completion of the Suez Canal in 1869 revolutionized global geography. Henceforth, the route to India passed through the Mediterranean and the Red Sea, shortening the journey by thousands of kilometers. The British immediately understood the strategic importance of this passage. In 1875, the British government bought the Khedive of Egypt's shares in the Canal Company, and in 1882, after a national revolt, the British Army occupied Egypt. Officially temporary, this occupation lasted decades. It was in this context that the scramble for Africa began. From the 1880s, European powers, France, Germany, Belgium, Portugal, and Great Britain, launched into a frantic race to carve up the continent. The Berlin Conference of 1884-1885 formalized this competition, drawing borders on maps that often disregarded peoples and local realities. For the British Empire, the goal was clear: to link Cairo to the Cape, creating a north-south territorial continuum. This ambition was driven by men like Cecil Rhodes, a mining magnate and fervent imperialist. His dream was a railway from Cape to Cairo, connecting all British colonies. Though never fully realized, this project symbolized Britain's desire for hegemony in Africa. Rhodes also embodied the ambiguities of imperialism. A visionary to some, a brutal exploiter to others, he profoundly shaped the continent's history. Wars marked this expansion. In southern Africa, the British first faced the Zulus in the War of 1879. The Zulu kingdom, led by King Cetshwayo, inflicted a stinging defeat on the English at Isandlwana before being crushed at Ulundi. Then came the Boer Wars, pitting the empire against Dutch-origin settlers. These conflicts at the century's end were among the hardest the British fought, marked by prolonged sieges, the use of concentration camps, and fierce resistance. In East Africa, the British established their domination in Kenya and Uganda, building the famous Uganda Railway, crossing plains and forests at the cost of thousands of lives. In West Africa, they took hold in Nigeria, imposing control over a vast and rich territory, blending ethnic groups and kingdoms with ancient traditions. British expansion in Africa was thus both brutal and ambitious. It brought infrastructure, schools, and hospitals, but primarily for the benefit of settlers and imperial administration. It transformed entire societies, disrupting their structures, imposing new borders, and creating an economy geared toward export. For African peoples, it was an era of domination, resistance, and profound change. For the Victorians, however, Africa became one of the symbols of their imperial mission. London newspapers published explorers' accounts, maps of new colonies, and impassioned imperialist speeches. The British flag now flew over vast territories, from the Nile Delta to the Transvaal Plains, from the Niger's banks to Kenya's highlands. By the end of the 19th century, the British Empire controlled nearly a third of the African continent. Its presence stretched from Egypt to South Africa, from Sierra Leone to Nigeria, from Kenya to Sudan. The dream of a Cape to Cairo line seemed almost within reach. Thus, Africa, once peripheral, became a pillar of the empire. Its mineral wealth, strategic positions, and agricultural lands fueled British power. And in the Victorian imagination, every victory, every conquest, every new colony reinforced the idea of an empire on which the sun never set. But behind the glory in red-colored maps, tensions were mounting. Colonized peoples had not yet spoken their final word. The 20th century would see the rise of resistance and independence movements. For now, however, at the twilight of the 19th century, Africa joined the Indian jewel to make the British imperial zenith resplendent. Part 3. The Dominions and the Anglophone World. At the twilight of the 19th century, the British Empire spanned territories so vast it seemed to defy the limits of geography. It was said then that it was the empire on which the sun never sets. For at every moment somewhere on the globe, the Union Jack flew over a port, a garrison, a colony. But this empire was not uniform. It was a mosaic of very different possessions, ranging from directly administered colonies to dominions. Those distant lands populated mainly by European origin settlers who enjoyed particular autonomy. These dominions formed a unique category within the imperial edifice. They were neither ordinary colonies nor fully independent nations. They were privileged members of the imperial family, bound to London by loyalty, language, and institutions, but largely self-governed. Canada, Australia, New Zealand, and later South Africa would embody this evolution. Canada, first, held a unique place. Conquered from France in 1763, it had become a British colony, where two peoples coexisted. The Anglophone settlers, mainly in Ontario and the Maritimes, and the Francophone population of Quebec, heirs to New France. This duality gave rise to a fragile but foundational balance. In 1867, Canada became the first official dominion, with its own constitution, parliament, and autonomous government, while remaining loyal to the Crown. Ottawa, the capital, embodied this synthesis. A new nation, still dependent on London, but already endowed with its own identity. Australia, a penal colony turned settler colony, followed a similar path. Over the 19th century, the Australian colonies, enriched by wool, gold, and agricultural expansion, demanded greater autonomy. In 1901, they united to form the Commonwealth of Australia, a full-fledged dominion. Australian society, marked by its British roots, nonetheless developed a distinct culture turned toward the vastness of the continent and the maritime horizons of the Pacific. New Zealand, colonized later in the 1840s, followed suit. Treaties with the Maori peoples, such as the Treaty of Waitangi in 1840, were often violated, leading to wars and dispossession. But by the end of the 19th century, New Zealand, too, had become a prosperous dominion, proud of its particular identity, yet steadfastly loyal to Britain. South Africa was a more complex case. The British had inherited the Cape Colony, dominated by the Boers, and then extended their control after the Anglo-Boer Wars. In 1910, the British colonies and former Boer republics were united in the Union of South Africa, a dominion loyal to the Crown, but deeply marked by racial and social tensions that would shape its future history. These dominions, though autonomous, remained united by a language, institutions, and a common culture. English in particular became the cement of a new world, the Anglophone world. From Canada to the Caribbean, from Australia to South Africa, millions of men and women shared a language, a legal system derived from common law, and loyalty to the Crown. It was more than an empire. It was a community of peoples, a cultural space spanning oceans. This unity also manifested in politics. When London went to war, the dominions followed. Their soldiers fought in imperial campaigns. Their ports welcomed Royal Navy ships. Their wealth fueled the common economy. In the empire's wars, from the battlefields of Sudan to the plains of southern Africa, Dominion flags flew alongside the Union Jack. But this solidarity was not only imposed, it was also chosen. Many settlers felt proud to belong to the empire. For them, being British meant sharing a civilization, values, a mission. Newspapers, schools, and churches spread this idea of a united imperial family where each dominion was both distinct and tied to the whole. London, for its part, saw in the dominions proof of colonial success. Territories that, far from being mere possessions, had become sister nations sharing British ideals. This vision nourished imperial ideology. The empire was not just domination, but an expanding common civilization. Yet behind the displayed harmony, deep differences remained. The dominions were privileged, populated mainly by Europeans, endowed with political freedoms. But elsewhere, in India, Africa, and the Caribbean, millions of colonial subjects remained without rights, governed without representation. The British Empire was an unequal edifice, where some enjoyed near independence while others endured rigid domination. In the 19th century, however, the triumphant image prevailed. In London's Universal exhibitions, in the red-colored maps hung on schoolroom walls, in Queen Victoria's speeches, the empire appeared as a vast and powerful family. The sun rose over India, shone on Africa, illuminated the Australian plains, and caressed the Canadian forests. And everywhere, in ports, courts, and parliaments, the language of Shakespeare was spoken, and loyalty was sworn to the crown. Thus, at the zenith of the Victorian era, the British Empire was not merely a territorial construct. It had become a cultural and political world, a web connecting entire continents. The dominions, particular jewels of this edifice, symbolized the empire's transformation. From a collection of scattered colonies, it had become a coherent universe, unified by the sea, language, and law. And in this expanding Anglophone world, the British saw themselves not only as masters, but as guides, convinced they were fulfilling a civilizing mission. The 20th century would put this conviction to the test. But for now, at the height of its glory, the British Empire could present itself as a community of nations avant la lettre, powerful, proud, and confident in its destiny. Chapter 4: The World Wars and the Decline. Part 1: The First World War and the Territorial Apogee. At the dawn of the 20th century, the British Empire dominated the world like no other power before it. It covered nearly a quarter of the Earth's landmass, gathered some 400 million inhabitants under its banner, and its ships plied every ocean. London, the imperial capital, was not merely a city. It was the beating heart of a global system, a metropolis from which orders, goods, and capital flowed. It was said that the sun never set on the British Empire because it spanned the entire planet. But this triumph was about to be tested by an unprecedented storm, the First World War. Never had the empire faced a war so total, mobilizing all its resources, all its territories, all its peoples. And never had it displayed such apparent unity. When the United Kingdom declared war on Germany in August 1914, the entire empire went to war. The dominions, Canada, Australia, New Zealand, South Africa, followed without hesitation. India, still directly subject to the crown, sent hundreds of thousands of soldiers. The colonies in Africa and the Caribbean provided troops, resources, and supplies. It was a planetary mobilization. On the battlefields of Europe, the Empire's soldiers fought side by side with the British. Canadians distinguished themselves at Vimy. Australians and New Zealanders shed their blood at Gallipoli. Indians fought in France, Belgium, and Mesopotamia. Never had the world seen such an imperial army, bringing together men of all races, religions, and origins, united under the Union Jack. The war was a terrible ordeal. In the trenches, losses were staggering. But paradoxically, it strengthened the empire's cohesion. The dominions in particular discovered in the fire of battle a new national consciousness. Shared sacrifices became the foundations of distinct identities. Canada at Vimy, Australia and New Zealand at Gallipoli forged their national myths, narratives that, while tying them to the empire, distinguished them as nations in their own right. The Royal Navy, true to its role, ensured mastery of the seas. It imposed a blockade on Germany, cut off its supplies, and secured imperial routes. Without it, colonial troops could never have reached Europe, nor could supplies and munitions have circulated. The British fleet, though challenged by German U-boats, remained the empire's guardian. When the war ended in 1918, the British Empire emerged seemingly strengthened. The peace treaties granted it new territories. Former German colonies in Africa, such as Togo, Cameroon, and Namibia, came under British mandate. The Middle East, carved up after the fall of the Ottoman Empire, was also divided. Iraq, Transjordan, and Palestine were entrusted to the United Kingdom. The empire reached its maximum extent. Never had it been so vast. Yet, behind this grandeur, cracks were appearing. The war had disrupted balances. The colonies had made an immense effort, often at the cost of blood, and many began to demand more in return. In India, in particular, the nationalist movement gained new momentum. Promises of autonomy made by London during the war were poorly kept. Figures like Gandhi and Nehru emerged, carried by the resentment of a people who had given so much to an empire that continued to treat them as subjects. The dominions, meanwhile, emerged from the war with a heightened sense of autonomy. Their direct participation, their sacrifices, and their place at the victor's table, since they signed the Treaty of Versailles in their own names, gave them an unprecedented international status. Canada, Australia, New Zealand, and South Africa remained loyal to the crown, but they began to assert themselves as sovereign nations in the making. Great Britain, for its part, had paid a colossal price. The war had drained its coffers, exhausted its manpower, and weakened its economy. It remained the foremost colonial power, but its authority increasingly relied on compromises and precarious balances. The shadow of the United States, enriched by the war in Japan, a rising power in Asia, began to loom. Thus, paradoxically, the First World War was both the apogee and the beginning of decline. Apogee because never had the empire been so vast, never had it shown such unity. Decline because the seeds of emancipation, nationalism, and economic fragility had taken root everywhere. In 1919, in London, the parade of victorious imperial troops electrified the capital. Soldiers from every continent marched through the city to cheers. For many, it was the very image of British grandeur, a universal, protective, triumphant empire. But behind the smiles, some already knew that the edifice rested on fragile foundations. For the peoples who had fought for the empire would soon demand their rights, and Great Britain, weakened, would have to face a century of storms, where its red flags would gradually fold, giving way to new nations. Part 2. The Second World War and the Loss of Prestige. When the Second World War broke out in September 1939, the British Empire was still immense, but it was no longer as confident in its strength as in 1914. The Great War had bled the country, weakened its economy, and indebted its metropolis. Facing Nazi Germany, allied with fascist Italy and soon Imperial Japan, the empire was plunged into an ordeal even more terrible than the previous one. From the outset of the conflict, the United Kingdom called upon all its imperial resources. The Dominions once again answered the call. Canada, Australia, New Zealand, and South Africa mobilized their armies and fleets. India, still a colony, provided millions of soldiers. Troops from the Caribbean, Africa, and Asia joined British forces. It was a global mobilization, but this time it faced an even more dangerous and organized enemy. London, bombed in 1940 during the Blitz, became the symbol of resistance. Winston Churchill, the Prime Minister, galvanized his people and the empire with his steely speeches. "We shall never surrender," resonated to the farthest reaches of the colonies. The entire empire seemed united in a life-or-death struggle against Nazism. The Royal Navy once again played an essential role. It protected Atlantic convoys against German U-boats, ensured the island's survival, and enabled the transport of troops and supplies. But this time, the task was more daunting. Germany and Italy dominated vast portions of Europe and the Mediterranean. The British Empire, though immense, seemed on the defensive. In the North African desert, British troops, supported by Commonwealth soldiers, faced Rommel's forces. In Burma and Malaya, Japan's advance overwhelmed British positions. The fall of Singapore in February 1942 was a devastating blow. This fortress, presented as impregnable, fell in days, leading to the capture of tens of thousands of soldiers. For world opinion, it was a clear sign. Great Britain was no longer invincible. In India, the war took on a particular dimension. Millions of Indians volunteered or were mobilized into the British Army, fighting in Africa, the Middle East, and Asia. But at the same time, the nationalist movement intensified. Gandhi launched the Quit India movement in 1942, demanding immediate independence. The British harshly repressed protests, but the seed was sown. India, the jewel of the crown, would not remain under domination forever. The war wore down the empire. True, victories came with time. El Alamein in 1942, the reconquest of Italy, the Normandy landings in 1944. The British Empire contributed massively to the final victory against Germany and Japan. But the cost was immense. Human losses, destruction, and debt contracted to the United States left the United Kingdom drained. Above all, the war profoundly altered the balance of power. Two giants emerged from the conflict, the United States and the Soviet Union. Beside them, the British Empire seemed aged, exhausted. London was no longer the sole center of the world. Washington and Moscow would now dictate the planet's future. The war had also shaken the empire's image. British propaganda had exalted the idea of a fight for freedom and democracy. But in the colonies, many wondered why these principles did not apply to them. Hundreds of thousands of men had fought and shed their blood for the empire. Why should they not in turn enjoy independence and rights? In the years following the war, decolonization accelerated. India, in 1947, was the first major colony to gain independence, quickly followed by Pakistan. This loss, immense symbolically, marked the beginning of the empire's dismantling. In Africa, Asia, and the Middle East, nationalist movements grew stronger. The war had sapped British prestige and opened the way to a new world. Yet, even in its weakening, the British Empire had shown its strength. It had resisted alone in 1940 against Nazi Germany. It had mobilized its territories and peoples to wage a global war. It had contributed decisively to the Allied victory. But this triumph was paradoxical. It carried within it the seeds of the end. For the Second World War revealed a truth no one could ignore. Great Britain was no longer the dominant power. Its colonies aspired to freedom, its finances were ruined, its place on the world stage diminished. The empire, vast and glorious, was entering its twilight. Thus, in the aftermath of 1945, while London celebrated victory and its flag still flew over vast territories, a cycle was ending. The British Empire had survived 2 world wars, but it would not long survive peace. For now, the colonized peoples would make their voices heard, and the new powers, America and the USSR, would reshape the world. Part 3. The Independences and the End of an Empire. The year 1945 marked victory, but also the beginning of an irreversible transformation. The British Empire, which had withstood the storms of 2 world wars, entered an era of twilight. Financially exhausted, militarily weakened, and rivaled by the United States and the Soviet Union, Great Britain realized it could no longer hold its vast empire with an iron grip. Above all, the colonized peoples, who had shed their blood for victory, no longer accepted domination. The first breach was India. For decades, the nationalist movement there had been gaining strength. Gandhi, with his strategy of nonviolent resistance, had mobilized millions of Indians around the idea of independence. Nehru, a rising political figure, embodied the will for a modern state. The Second World War had accelerated the process. India had provided millions of soldiers, but its demands for freedom remained ignored. In 1947, under the unbearable pressure of mobilizations and growing religious tensions between Hindus and Muslims, Great Britain decided to leave the subcontinent. Independence was proclaimed, but at the cost of a tragic partition. India and Pakistan were born in blood, millions were displaced, and hundreds of thousands perished. For the empire, it was an immense loss, both symbolic and material. The jewel of the crown had detached itself. This departure marked the beginning of a wave. In the following decades, Africa, the Middle East, and Asia saw independences flourish. In 1948, Burma and Ceylon left the empire. In the 1950s, it was the turn of Ghana, the first African colony to break its chains in 1957, soon followed by Nigeria, Kenya, Tanzania, Zambia, and many others. The 1960s were a time of massive decolonization. The process was sometimes peaceful, negotiated between London and local elites, but it was also marked by violence. In Kenya, the Mau Mau rebellion was repressed with ferocious brutality. In Cyprus, the struggle for independence led to a civil war and British intervention. In Malaya, a communist guerrilla forced the British into a long and difficult war. Everywhere, European settlers and British forces faced determined nationalist movements, sometimes armed, sometimes political, but always driven by the conviction that the imperial era had to end. In Palestine, the end of the British mandate was particularly dramatic. Tensions between Jewish and Arab communities, exacerbated after the Holocaust, spiraled out of the control of colonial authorities. In 1948, the British withdrew, paving the way for the creation of the State of Israel and a war that reshaped the Middle East lastingly. In Africa, decolonization transformed the continent's map in just a few years. British flags were replaced by new national banners, capitals became independent, and a generation of African leaders, from Kwame Nkrumah to Jomo Kenyatta, took power. British imperial grandeur faded before a new multipolar world where London could no longer impose its will. This withdrawal was also explained by economic reality. After 1945, the United Kingdom was ruined, dependent on American aid, unable to maintain its armed forces across all continents. The colonies cost more than they yielded. Washington, meanwhile, encouraged decolonization, hoping to replace British influence with its own. In this context, London chose to withdraw, sometimes with dignity, sometimes in chaos. Yet, the empire did not entirely disappear. What remained was the Commonwealth of Nations, an organization created to maintain a link between Great Britain and its former colonies. In this community, newly independent nations could cooperate on an equal footing while retaining cultural, economic, and symbolic ties with London. The Queen remained the head of the Commonwealth, a figurehead of a family of now sovereign states. Thus, the United Kingdom transitioned from the role of imperial master to that of partner. The transformation was painful, but it prevented in many cases a brutal collapse. Great Britain found a new place in the world, no longer as a hegemonic imperial power, but as an influential nation within a global network. The end of the British Empire was not a sudden event, but a process spread over several decades. It was made of retreats, compromises, bloody struggles, and patient negotiations. But as flags changed, a truth emerged. The imperial era was over. For the British, this decline was both a wound and a liberation. A wound because it marked the end of centuries-old grandeur, the renunciation of the illusion of global domination. A liberation because it allowed a focus on internal reconstruction, parliamentary democracy, and a European and Atlantic future. By the end of the 20th century, little remained of the British Empire. A few overseas territories like Gibraltar, the Falklands, and Hong Kong until 1997. But its imprint was everywhere, in the English language, now global, in legal systems, in blended cultures. Thus ended a story that began with the clamor of Elizabethan corsairs and Drake's dreams. The British Empire, which had ruled the seas, dominated continents, and influenced billions of lives, had faded away, but its immense shadow continued to haunt the modern world. Chapter 5. Legacy and the Contemporary World. Part 1. Culture, Language, and the Commonwealth. The end of the British Empire did not mean the end of its influence. On the contrary, while the Territorial Empire had faded, its cultural, linguistic, and institutional legacy remained powerful and omnipresent. The union of seas and continents, forged over centuries of conquest, trade, and domination, left an indelible mark. And it is perhaps here, more than in battles or territories, that the true grandeur of the former British Empire resides today. The first legacy, the most obvious, is the English language. Originally a mere insular idiom spoken on a gray island in northern Europe, English became, thanks to the empire, a global language. In the ports of India, in the schools of Africa, in the courts of the Caribbean, English established itself as the language of administration, commerce, and justice. Colonists used it to govern, local elites adopted it to rise, and soon it became a shared tool. Today, over 1 billion people speak English, whether as a native or second language. It is the language of Shakespeare and Dickens, but also of airports, universities, science, and the internet. This linguistic legacy, sometimes the result of brutal imposition, has transformed into a vector of universality. From Nigeria to India, from Canada to Australia, English still connects different worlds in a shared space. The second legacy lies in institutions and law. The British parliamentary system, common law, and the idea of representative government spread far beyond London. In many countries, formerly part of the empire, constitutions incorporate elements of the British model: separation of powers, parliamentary sovereignty, and the symbolic role of the head of state. Even when these institutions were contested, they left deep traces. The third legacy is the Commonwealth. Born in the 1930s, it solidified after the Second World War as a peaceful continuation of the empire. This organization today brings together over 50 nations, large and small, rich and poor, sharing a common history and cooperating in various fields: economy, education, human rights, sports. At the heart of this Commonwealth, the symbolic figure of the British monarch long played a unifying role. Queen Elizabeth in particular was for generations the face of a community of states with diverse cultures, but united by a shared memory. The Commonwealth Games, held regularly, are a sporting illustration of this network of legacies. This Commonwealth is a voluntary organization. No state is forced to belong. This is a key difference from the Empire. Member nations choose to participate, to share a framework, cooperation, and a certain solidarity. Of course, this link remains marked by past inequalities, and it is sometimes criticized as an imperial relic. But it also testifies to the former British Empire's ability to reinvent itself in a new form. British influence is also found in culture. English literature, with its great authors, spread through the empire. But more than that, colonial exchanges fostered a unique cultural blending. Music from the Caribbean influenced the streets of London. Indian flavors transformed British cuisine, and African and Asian voices enriched Anglophone literature. The empire, despite its violence and injustices, created a space of interactions that continues to resonate in art, music, and gastronomy. The imperial imprint is also geographical. The borders drawn by the British, sometimes arbitrary, often contested, still structure entire nations today. From the Middle East to Africa, from South Asia to the Pacific, current maps bear the mark of decisions made in London. Sometimes this legacy has sparked lasting conflicts, but it has also given rise to modern states that have reappropriated this geography to build their own destinies. Finally, there is a psychological and symbolic legacy. For some peoples, the empire was an unjust domination, a time of humiliation whose memories remain painful. For others, it was a framework for modernization, education, and opening to the world. In all cases, it remains an inescapable reference. Debates about colonization, its supposed benefits, and its undeniable violence still traverse contemporary societies in Great Britain and elsewhere. In the 21st century, Great Britain is no longer an empire. It is a middle power, a member of the G7, influential but far from dominating the world. Yet, its imperial legacy gives it a unique place. Through language, through the Commonwealth's networks, through popular culture, it continues to exert considerable soft power. British cinema, music, and universities attract millions. The Westminster model still inspires democracies. English remains the language of globalization. Thus, if the sun has set on the empire, it still shines on its legacy. The British Empire no longer exists, but its traces continue to shape the contemporary world. In the words we speak, in the institutions we use, in the cultures we share, it lives on both as memory and as presence. And in the Commonwealth, in this strange family of former colonies and new states, an idea born of the empire persists, that of a global network, fragile but real, where Great Britain continues to play a symbolic role. Part 2. The Shadows of the Empire. Slavery, colonization, painful memories. The history of the British Empire, often told in terms of grandeur and expansion, cannot be understood without its shadows. Behind the red maps hung on Victorian schoolroom walls, behind tales of naval glory and imperial splendor, lies a darker reality: exploitation, violence, slavery, and the painful memories left to colonized peoples. From its origins, the British Empire was tied to the triangular trade. In the 17th and 18th centuries, thousands of British ships crossed the Atlantic to transport African slaves to plantations in the Americas and the Caribbean. The ports of Bristol, Liverpool, and London grew rich from this inhumane traffic. Millions of men, women, and children were torn from their lands, deported in appalling conditions to work until death in sugar, cotton, or tobacco fields. This trade, an immense source of wealth, was one of the pillars of the imperial economy. Plantations generated colossal fortunes. British factories sold their goods to the colonies, and profits fueled the Industrial Revolution. But behind this prosperity lay a human tragedy of unprecedented scale. At the start of the 19th century, an abolitionist movement, driven by religion and humanist ideas, succeeded in shifting mentalities. In 1807, the slave trade was banned in the British Empire, and in 1833, slavery was officially abolished in the colonies. This was a historic step, but a late one. For over 2 centuries, Great Britain had profited from slavery, and even after its abolition, former slaves received no reparations. It was the plantation owners who were compensated by the British state. The shadow of slavery still haunts the memory of former colonies and British cities. Monuments, banks, universities, and even churches bear the traces of fortunes built on human trafficking. In the Caribbean, Africa, and America, the memory of this suffering remains vivid, passed down from generation to generation. But slavery was only one facet. Colonization itself was accompanied by multiple forms of violence. In India, British domination imposed a foreign order, disrupting millennia-old social structures. The 19th century famines were exacerbated by colonial policies that prioritized exports over the survival of local populations. In 1919, the Amritsar massacre, where British soldiers fired on a peaceful crowd, killed hundreds and symbolized the brutality of a regime that claimed to embody civilization. In Africa, colonization was imposed by force. Wars against the Zulus, Ashantis, and Boers left deep scars. The concentration camps used by the British during the Second Boer War testified to extreme violence, with women and children interned in terrible conditions. In African colonies, economic exploitation went hand in hand with political domination that disregarded local cultures and imposed artificial borders. Even in the dominions, often presented as colonial successes, shadows remain. In Australia and New Zealand, Aboriginal and Maori peoples were dispossessed of their lands, victims of wars, diseases, and discrimination. Their cultures were marginalized, their children torn from families to be placed in institutions aimed at assimilating them. These policies of forced civilization left traumas whose echoes still resonate today. In the Caribbean, indentured laborers from India or Asia, brought in after the abolition of slavery, were also exploited in harsh conditions. This system, meant to replace slave labor, in reality reproduced a barely disguised form of servitude. The British Empire often presented itself as a civilizing force, bringing roads, railways, schools, and hospitals. But these infrastructures primarily served to exploit the colonies and maintain control. Benefits rarely reached local populations. The rhetoric of progress masked realities of injustice and dispossession. Even today, these painful memories fuel debates. In former colonies, many see the empire as a period of oppression from which they must heal. In Great Britain itself, statues, street names, and museums testify to this complex history. Some call for their removal or contextualization. Others defend the idea of an assumed heritage. For the shadows of the empire are not merely memories. They still influence the present. Economic inequalities, social fractures, and racial tensions sometimes have their roots in centuries of colonial domination. Migratory flows, which have made Great Britain a multicultural society, are also the legacy of this defunct empire. Recognizing these shadows does not mean erasing imperial history, but understanding it in its entirety. The British Empire was both a creator of global networks and a destroyer of local societies, a bearer of modernization, and a generator of suffering. Its legacy is dual, luminous, and dark, and it is in this duality that its truth lies. Thus, behind images of glory and tales of expansion, we must hear the voices of slaves torn from Africa, of Indian peasants starved, of African warriors defeated, of aboriginals dispossessed, of peoples silenced. They, too, are part of the history of the British Empire, a history that can only be told by accounting for all its facets. For if the empire shaped the modern world, it also marked it with deep scars. And these scars, visible or invisible, remind us that behind every empire lie broken lives, wounded memories, and truths that must be faced. Part 3. Post-Imperial Britain and Modern Soft Power. When the 20th century reached its second half, the British Empire no longer existed. The red flags that once covered the world map had faded, replaced by new independent nations. London was no longer the center of a global empire, but the capital of an insular European state, weakened by wars and relegated to the rank of a middle power. Yet, the story did not end there, for if the empire had vanished, Great Britain found a new place in the world, no longer as a dominator of seas and continents, but as a power of culture, influence, and soft power. The post-war period was marked by a long process of redefinition. The United Kingdom, stripped of its colonies, had to reinvent itself. Its first strategy was to integrate into new alliances. In 1949, it was a founding member of NATO, placing its security under American aegis in the context of the Cold War. In 1973, it joined the European Economic Community, seeking to offset the loss of colonial markets with integration into Europe. But beyond politics and economics, it was in the realm of cultural influence that Great Britain found a new, intangible, but powerful empire. The English language inherited from the empire became the primary tool of this influence. In business, science, diplomacy, and media, English established itself as the global lingua franca. British universities, from Oxford to Cambridge, attracted students from across the planet. Anglophone authors, playwrights, and thinkers influenced universal literature and philosophy. Through language, Great Britain remained present in minds everywhere. English became the language of the future. Popular culture amplified this presence. From the 1960s, British music conquered the world. The Beatles, the Rolling Stones, Pink Floyd, and later Queen or Adele made British influence resonate on every radio. Cinema, carried by James Bond, Harry Potter, or BBC productions, spread British images, stories, and accents into every household. Television series, documentaries, and theater plays radiated British creativity. Sports influence added to this. Football, born on English pitches, became the world's most popular sport. English clubs, from Manchester United to Liverpool, Chelsea to Arsenal, became global brands. The Premier League, broadcast across all continents, made the United Kingdom the beating heart of a global spectacle, followed by billions of fans. The Commonwealth, though weakened, continued to serve as a symbolic link. The Commonwealth Games regularly brought together nations once colonized. Queen Elizabeth II, a figure of stability and continuity, remained the symbolic head of this organization until her death. Through her, the former empire persisted as a voluntary family, more flexible and egalitarian than before. But this soft power was not limited to culture. The United Kingdom also retained diplomatic and moral influence. As a permanent member of the UN Security Council, a nuclear power, and an ally of Washington, it continued to weigh in global affairs. In international crises, the British voice, heir to a vanished empire, remained heard. This redefinition was not without contradictions. Internally, imperial memory sparked debates and divisions. Some Britons, nostalgic, saw the empire as a lost golden age. Others, critical, recalled the colonial violence and injustices. Statues, museums, and textbooks became battlegrounds of memory, where imperial history was passionately debated. Abroad, British influence was also ambivalent. In former colonies, the memory of domination remained painful. Yet at the same time, the English language, institutions, and British culture remained familiar references. Many post-colonial nations maintained a complex relationship with London, marked by both mistrust and proximity. By the end of the 20th century and the start of the 21st, Great Britain thus presented itself as a post-imperial power, no longer the master of the planet, but a respected actor in a globalized world. It played a major role in international finance through the City of London. It maintained an active diplomacy, oscillating between Europe and the Atlantic, between the European Union and the American alliance. Above all, it exerted a cultural influence disproportionate to its actual size. For if the empire had vanished, an idea remained. Great Britain had given the world a language, a culture, a way of organizing politics and society. This legacy, complex and sometimes contested, remained alive. In the classrooms of Nairobi, in the courts of Delhi, in the stadiums of Lagos or Sydney, in the libraries of Toronto or Kingston, the British imprint was still felt. Thus, the history of the British Empire did not end with its fall. It transformed. From the brute force of conquests, it shifted to the soft power of influence. From a territorial empire, it became an invisible empire, made of words, music, films, and ideas. Even today, the United Kingdom is no longer the empire, but it remains its heir. In the Anglophone world, in the Commonwealth, in globalization, the shadow of this past persists. And if the sun has truly set on the colonies, it continues to shine on an intangible legacy that makes Great Britain a nation still singular, still present. For the British Empire, despite its disappearance, remains one of history's most powerful mirrors, a mirror reflecting both grandeur and violence, glory and wounds, power and memory. And in this mirror, the contemporary world continues to see its own face, shaped, for better or worse, by centuries of British domination. Thank you for joining me tonight on this journey through history. I hope this tale has brought you peace and wonder. Don't forget to subscribe to Twilight Tales for more stories to guide you into a serene sleep. Take care and see you soon.